Welcome again to the Founders First podcast presented by ARIISE Partners. My name is Ryan Kohler, CEO and founder of ARIISE and ARIISE Partners. With me today is Chris Schuring, CEO and founder of Okavate, based out of Sacramento. We are on episode 4, so still early on in the podcast, but we're learning a whole bunch about how these founders got to where they're at and ultimately how they can help each other as they progress. So without further ado, welcome Chris Schuring with Okavate.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast with you. By the way, I'm the chief operating officer. The CEO would get mad at me if I took his credit, although we think with the same brain a lot. But I appreciate being on the podcast with you today and having the opportunity to talk about Okavate. Okavate is a company that's founded in 2019, actually. So we've been out here for a little while. We're in the atmospheric water generation space. So we're trying to solve water problems around the world from a commercial and industrial standpoint, and solving those not only with science and technology, but with a piece of equipment called an atmospheric water generation, which the largest is about the size of a semi-truck. We've been in development for a while, and my partner, the CEO, has been involved for about 5 years prior to 2019 with atmospheric water generation as well, and has a real good depth of knowledge of the policy and procedures around water. I'm more of the technical kind of guy and running operations for the company. So we're really looking forward to what not only the industry has to offer, but what we can offer the industry as we go forward to help solve water problems around the world.
Excellent. Well, now that we understand that, and again, I apologize for calling you the EO instead of the OO, but I'm sure the EO will forgive both of us.
You know, I've been called a lot of things in my life, some of them in foreign languages, and they're all good.
Hey, I gave you a promotion on some level, right?
I appreciate it.
Everyone always talks about the journey to get there. Right. So you've been doing this for 5 years. You're doing something huge, right? Atmospheric water is where probably the future is going to be. So with all of that said, how did it get to here? Walk us through the journey.
Well, I actually started in technology back in the early 80s, late 70s at a company that everybody might know called Atari. And so I've been a technician and an operations guy since then. And I look at opportunities in the world that need to be solved. And I want to say about 12 years ago, I got involved in algae production. And we were working with algae to do carbon capture and storage from power plants. And at that time, somebody approached me for our offices and said, "Hey, would you like to test out this atmospheric water generation piece of equipment for your offices?" I said, "Sure." So they brought it in, and it produced a couple quarts a day of water. It was kind of a novelty kind of thing. But I got kind of a little bit of a taste of what atmospheric water generation could do without having any inputs such as a water line. But at the time, the residential version of what they were generating was not really efficient. It was using a lot of power, not generating a lot of water. Again, it was kind of a novelty kind of thing. Roll forward to about 2018, 2019. Between those times, I started a solar company and did a bunch of other things along the way. I was approached again to take a look at atmospheric water generation as an industry. Well, as I was researching, I realized there is no real industry for atmospheric water generation. There's groups of companies. There's probably, I'll say, 200 companies on the planet that work in that space, 85% of which are distributors of the other 15% companies, right? So there's only about 15% of the companies out there who are actually building something. And of those 15%, probably 50% of them is one company. And so I started looking at that and decided to get involved for 2 reasons. One is water is an issue, right? No matter what you're doing, whether it's power, whether it's computing, whether it's agriculture, whether it's saving lives, those kinds of things, water is what sustains life on this planet. But nobody was really addressing the industrial aspect of it, the large scale, the disaster recovery, all those kinds of things. So we decided to get involved with it and focus on the efficiencies and technologies around commercial and industrial applications. And as we've been doing that, we had a little bit of a hiccup in the middle with this thing called COVID. It slowed us down externally, didn't slow us down internally, but we've been building the company internally ever since 2019. Now we have, like on our engineering team, we've got a chief engineer coming out of the aerospace industry with 35, 40 years of experience. We have a manufacturing person who actually teaches at a couple of local universities here in California. We have another engineer who was on the team that built the first supercomputer for Intel. Not just the computer, but the actual chipset that went into the supercomputer at Intel. So we're looking at the new technologies and how we can incorporate that into what we already know about the equipment for atmospheric water. I'm using my background in technology and in energy, waste energy, solar, all those kinds of things, thermal energy, thermal energy, and those things. We're using all those applications along with new technologies, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and those kinds of things to create where we're going to in 2025. And in 2025, we will be the largest and only manufacturer in the United States of industrial scale atmospheric water generation equipment. And it's only
No, that's
possible
fantastic.
with my 40 years of technical background, my partner's 40 years of policy background in the public sector, and the engineers that we've assembled. We're all in our 60s, but we're employing a lot of people and bringing a lot of people to the table that are between 20 and 30 because they're the technology experts of today. And we're applying things like manufacturing practices where we're going to build entire manufacturing facilities in virtual reality in the metaverse before we actually put a bolt in the ground to build a manufacturing so we can work all the bugs out. Right. So that's kind of what led us to where we are today. And we see a really bright future for 2025 and beyond.
That's fantastic. Now, you're more of a strategist. Most ops
Correct.
guys are. So, walk me through what's been the biggest challenge from the ops perspective slash the strategy perspective on bringing this semi truck size machine to
Right.
fruition.
Probably the biggest strategy, soft strategy, was the acceptance of the technology. It's like when I was involved in algae, I would go and I did lobbying at the Congress and Senate and the DOE in Washington, D.C., and we predominantly got the pushback of, "Oh, it doesn't work. Oh, it doesn't exist, or it can't exist." So the soft side pushback from strategy was, "It costs too much. It's not efficient enough," right? From an internal operations perspective of strategy, the hard strategy was, how do we address those issues, right? And we address those issues in a lot of different ways. Some of them are gonna be our secret sauce, but the way we address that is like the same thing I do when I talk to other companies and they say, "Our product costs too much to get in the marketplace. How do we change that?" So first you have to look at the value of your project, your product. What is the value? Not what the cost of your equipment is, but what's the value of what your equipment does? Because people don't buy cars because they wanna, well, some people do, buy cars because they wanna have a garage full of cars. They buy cars because it's a transportation mechanism to get them from point A to point B. So the real thing they're buying is that point A to point B, uh, transportation experience. So we had to address, if I was gonna create a large scale atmospheric water generation piece of equipment, what were they actually buying? Because we weren't selling equipment. So we changed our entire strategy around to we're solution providers, not equipment providers. So what we look at is what's the problem we're trying to solve? And we look at solving that problem with what just happens to be atmospheric water generation equipment. And then we don't sell the equipment, we sell the solution. And by selling the solution, the price components change for every solution. So we don't have to worry about prices or efficiencies and those kinds of things because let's say I'm producing a piece of equipment to solve a disaster in South Carolina because they needed drinking water. Well, what's a human life worth? What is getting water to a community that's going to suffer for 2 weeks when they don't have water? What's that worth? That is not a price you put on a piece of equipment. That's a price you put on the solution you provided.
Now let's pause right there. The equipment,
Right.
the size of it, obviously the transportation of it becomes an encumbrance. In
Right.
that scenario where flood or hurricane waters wipe out half a state,
Right.
how do you get that equipment? How close the equipment has to be to that area? Where is the equipment located? How does it transport? Give me the logistics challenging of that.
Right. And the logistics challenge I can address from being an over-the-road truck driver for 8 years. I understand logistics as well. And so the challenge is not the deployment of equipment at the time of crisis. You deploy the equipment prior to the crisis, right? The challenge with everybody is like, they say, "Oh, look, a hurricane's coming. Now we've got to solve the problem." Well, you should have solved the problem before the hurricane came. You know it was coming. They come every year, right? So the groups that we've been talking to, the disaster services companies and those kind of things we're talking to, and we're active in those discussions, is let's deploy this equipment ahead of time and leave it on site. So let's put a piece of equipment at, let's say, the local fire station. So if you live in a community of, say, 10,000 people or 20,000 or 30,000 people, you know where the local fire department is. All right. So let's deploy one next to the local fire department and leave it there. It's there all the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We have a service contract. We own the equipment, so we make sure it's technology available. We test it once a quarter to make sure it still works and all that kind of thing. And then we know, hey, NOAA and everybody else, the Weather Bureau is telling us that there's a tornado coming in 2 weeks. Let's fire up that piece of equipment, make sure it all works. Let's fill up a bladder with enough water for the community so it's running prior to the disaster and ready during the disaster. And it's all running on renewable energy, hydrogen fuel cells, batteries, and solar. Because when there's a disaster like that, there's no power.
Of
So
course.
you can't plug it into the
Now,
wall.
with that said, the
Mm,
equipment's on site. You're running the
mm,
quarterly checkups. You're doing the preemptive strike on the storage of water in a bladder system. All of that to be said. Your team's doing that.
right,
How big's the team? What's the cost per unit? Obviously storage is free. It sits in a lot or on a slab and it waits for you, waits for the disaster. But what does that look like on the logistics side back at Okavate to service these guys and to obviously be active and deployed upon these events?
right. And so, again, some of these things we still have yet to work out, to be honest, right? We know what we want to do and how we're going to do it. How we're looking at, I'm going to talk about the economic side of it for a moment. From the economic side of it, we've engaged several economics professionals. Some are professors in academia, some are professionals in corporate, and we've asked them these questions and looked at their responses from an economics point of view. How do we deal with this economically so that we would still make money and all that kind of thing? The other is logistically, the building that we're looking to purchase in Sacramento, in the Sacramento area, is on the port, and it also has a rail spur. So the delivery and logistics and its truck access available. So the delivery of equipment from that facility should be fairly smooth, right? It could be still have some cost components, but it should be fairly smooth. But then the general idea is, let's say we're going to service the southeast, 7 states of the southeast. Florida or to Texas kind of thing. Well, what we would do then is we would put a manufacturing facility down in that region of the United States. We'd manufacture them closer. Therefore, we're saving money on logistics. We're employing people. We're getting things done. But the research and development engineering will always be done here in California. But the large scale manufacturing will be done closer to the client base that we're trying to service. Number one. Number two, the challenge with the industry, if again, there isn't really an industry, but I'll just say that there is for the moment of this discussion. The challenge with the industry is that if I deploy a piece of equipment to Florida and I'm in California and it breaks, how do we get it fixed? Right? That's the problem in the industry right now currently. So if there's a company in Israel, they make a piece of equipment and they sell it to Guatemala. When it breaks in Guatemala, people in Guatemala just say, "Eh, just put it on the shelf. because we can't afford to have somebody come out here and fix it. So we just turn it off and move on. We survived before, we'll survive after. We'll just take this piece of equipment and scrap it. And that's been the problem in the industry. So we have a service and support plan that we're going to be rolling out that's going to support all this equipment. And it without is one of our secret sauce things. I can't get into great details with it, but basically we're going to do some mergers and acquisitions. And those mergers and acquisitions will be around service and support. So let's say we deploy a piece of equipment to Los Angeles. What we're going to do is we're going to find service and support organizations that meet our criteria. We're either going to joint venture with them, merge, or acquire them, and they'll be within 25, 50 miles of the equipment location. They'll still continue to do what they do as a business, whatever that is, but that service and support will be our dispatch center, so that when there's equipment breakdown, we can dispatch somebody and they can go fix it.
Well, that makes total sense. Now, we have a segment on the show that we like to call Who Helped You, Who Screwed You? So I'd like to segue into that and understand that you guys are on the verge of huge things. You're funding and getting ready to build this infrastructure, solve
Right.
some of these last, service / logistical issues, but ultimately
Right.
you're on the verge of it.
That's correct.
So now that you're here at the finish line or very close to it, the 2-yard line, where is the pat on the back? Who would you give credit to? Who would you thank who helped get you here? And then ultimately, could you have gotten here faster if a group or a vendor or a government or a person didn't screw you?
That's a good context for how I want to try to answer that question. One is, I'm a firm believer in everything that's happened in my life put me where I am today. So when I say the people who helped me were the same people who hurt me along the way because they taught me. I learned lessons and those kinds of things. So I'm not going to name names because that's not necessary. But everybody who was part of my life up until this point brought me to this point, and good, bad, or ugly. So there was a time where, from the challenging side, I was involved with what was called a pump and dump scheme. And so there was a group out of New York, a group that was a group of investors. They were in the solar business, and they decided to acquire my company. I said, "Sure, let's do that." They pumped up their own stock from press releases, sold their stock, made $30 million, and then told me that they weren't gonna fulfill their contracts and left me hold the bag on a company, and it cost me dearly. Now, there were people who said that if I could have gone out in the streets and created mayhem behind that, but then really that would not have served any purpose. So I just learned from it. I learned how to deal with different things. I learned, different things from it.
No,
I've
that's
had
a good
great
lesson for founders to
Yeah.
take every negative and learn from it and turn into a positive on the next thing, the next opportunity.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's a unique but important answer that basically everyone who does screw you does in fact help you, because along the way you're learning from those missteps and those unfortunate characters.
And you could use those things to be bitter, to have a negative attitude and all those kinds of things. But internally, you have to decide as a business founder, what really is your goal? What are you really trying to get to the end of the goal and help whoever you're trying to help with your product services? You can't do that if you're negative and you're bitter. So you've got to decide either you're going to move forward, learn from it, or go back and work at Carl's Jr. flipping breaders. There's really, for me, there's no in between. It's either one or the other. And I've had some great founders that I've worked with in the algae industry, in the solar industry. I worked with some great people. I'm working with a great guy right now in atmospheric water generation equipment. And, you know, you try to learn from all those experiences because at the end of the day, we are a combination of those experiences. Right? I'll be 64 in November. I've done a lot. Back in the day, I started as a lumberjack. So I set chokers in the woods in the Sierra Nevadas 45 years ago. Now
No, that's
I'm
fair. And I
about
think for
yeah,
me,
so
I actually have a slightly different perspective on it. I
Right.
think that you said there is no, like, the difference between, there's no choice. You have to go positive and see the next thing versus holding on to it and getting bitter over it. And I think there's a magic spot in the middle, the chip on the shoulder, using it as extra motivation, extra juice, those late hours, those tight times where your cash is tight and you're eating ramen instead of steak, and you don't have the ability to see the next 10 feet because you're too busy worried about the next foot. And those are the moments where I'm in those moments where that's the chip from those moments where I look back and on those, the bank that didn't help, or the guy who tried, the partner who bailed, or the whatever the case may be, the bad vendor. That's the moment where my eyes are droopy, caffeine's not touching it. There's a step past that I have to get to, and that's that moment that I use to get over that hump and to the next thing. So that's where I sit on that scale of bitterness versus, moving on and seeing it as a positive.
Well, I guess I don't see it as a chip on my shoulder. There are people who might say I have a chip on my shoulder, but I personally don't look at it that way. But I can guarantee you don't want to put me in a corner, um, right? Because I've had the experience to come out of that corner, and you'll still like me, but you will not like the experience.
No, of
Uh,
course.
and
Now
and
let me use that to get into the next segment,
yep,
which we talk about advice you would give to
for,
your younger self
for the,
or to founders. And I like you to answer both questions as separately as you can. If you could go back to 24-year-old Chris, what would you tell him that 64-year-old Chris knows and would consider it almost a Bible verse or a commandment?
well, I'm going to close the question with an actual Bible verse, but basically, what I would tell my 24-year-old self is focus. Right? I spent a lot of years unfocused, and I'm somewhat unfocused now, but focus on what you really wanna try to achieve. I wanna say this way, but I'm not sure it's gonna come across properly, but I don't wanna say don't put a lot of credence on what other people think, right? Now you wanna listen to what they have to say, like I tell people, "Go forth and discover, but I will make the decision." So be the owner of and responsible of your decisions, right? And listen to other people for their input. There was in my younger career, I didn't listen to anybody. I just did what I was gonna do because I thought I knew it all, and I didn't. But I went forth and I created lots of havoc along the way, and that is what it is. But my younger self, I would say, slow down just a heartbeat, not a lot, but focus and use those inputs from other people as actual part of your tool set, not as a rebuff of your intelligence.
Now, going back to the advice for founders, which is a little bit different than 24-year-old Chris,
Right.
going back to you meet these young founders, you're a mentor, you're a board member, you're an advisor to some founders. What do you tell? What's some of your cardinal rules that you tell to these young guys and young girls?
What I tell them is when you're looking at your product, let's say you're going to create a pen. When you're looking at your product and you look at your organization and you're thinking about strategy, get a third party perspective, not necessarily mine, not necessarily your family and friends and those kinds of things. Get a third party perspective and listen to the answer. Don't listen waiting to talk. Listen for the actual answer, right? You might find something about what you're doing that may be that diamond in the rough that you are unaware of. So I'm all about data, right? I understand the value of data. I started my technology career at Atari running and working in management information systems and realized that data was an important component of business. And so recently I was talking with a group and they were using drone technology for inspections and those kinds of things. And they had a great little software that was doing all kinds of algorithmic uh, actions to do inspections with drones. But they had not looked at the data that they were collecting and understanding that the data they were collecting was actually more valuable than the software and the drones that they had. And they had gotten so myopic. I tell people, don't get so myopic in what you're doing that you don't see what's going on around you, that you don't listen to third party perspective, not necessarily advice, but perspective on your products, goods, and services. As founders, we get so myopic. And when we get myopic and we're tunnel vision and we're only looking at what we're doing, we don't realize that there are other things external to what we're doing that can actually help us.
Now, that's a very good piece of advice. So, some other questions I'd always have for the ops guy versus the F guy, finance guy, or the M guy, the marketing guy. The O guy always piqued my interest because the O guy has to kind of know a little bit about everyone's job and also has to make sure that the decisions that are made up the tree, or depending upon how you look at the analogy, if the trunk is the C suite, goes up, and if the branches are the C's and goes down. But the ops guys I've always have questions for the ops guys, as in, how many people do you need to solve X problem? How many people do you need? What percentage would you say for a manufacturing firm with a product such as Okavate? How much in-house versus how much vendor would be a good question I'd ask.
Well, and that's always a balance, right? And it's really a balance towards what your long-term strategic business plan says, not as much as it relates to how many people. We have a different way of looking at business. We're developing a business model called the spherical economy. The spherical economy says, let's leverage all of our vendors, all of our vendors' vendors, and all the things that we have, not just from a supply chain standpoint, but from a services standpoint as well, so that we can help each other, so that we have less overhead. Because if I can reduce overhead, I can reduce cost of goods. If I can reduce cost of goods, I can enter in the marketplace at a better economic perspective, right? So what we look at is the challenge with the current large-scale development of atmospheric water systems is that everybody does them one at a time. So there are lots of, I don't want to say lots, there's probably 5 organizations in the United States I could call up tomorrow, and I could say, "I'd like you to build me one of these things," and they'll build one for me. But they build them one at a time. There's no scale, there's no nothing. They're very costly, and they take 10 to 12 months to get, right? Because it's not their core line of business. So when we look at these things from a staffing point of view and so forth, what the market demands is large scale manufacturing. We've got to build these like you do cars. I got to be able to put 10 a day off the assembly line kind of thing. Well, the challenge in this country, and this is kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but the challenge in this country is we haven't been teaching manufacturing processes for 35 years in the school system. So if I go out tomorrow and I have a $500,000 CNC machine that I need an operator for, they don't exist in this country. They just don't. And if I do find one, they're 50 years and older and they haven't worked on the newest equipment. It's nothing against that person, but that's just the problem we have. So part of our philosophy is to use the spherical economy to do economic development, right? So if I have this $500,000 CNC machine, I don't need to go find a CNC operator. I'm going to train one. I'm going to train one that works in the local area. And I'm not going to care whether they've got a degree or not. I want to know whether they have the aptitude to learn. They have the aptitude to learn, we'll put them to work. But then when it comes to things like human resources, legal, those kinds of things, we outsource those because that's not our core business. I'm not in the HR business. So what we do is we outsource those. So when somebody says, how many people are you in an HR department? I say 2, right? And they're liaisons to our vendor. That's it. I'm not going to
No,
have
it's a good strategy for founders to understand that if you focus on your core business, all of the services to serve that business can be outsourced, and it doesn't really
right,
affect you.
correct,
Specialize and find your niche and be amazing at it with your own people and your own knowledge and your own
correct.
stuff. All the other nooks and crannies, the accounting, the HR, the whatever, can be done by somebody who does that for a living.
That's correct. And there's plenty of professionals out there, both onshore and offshore, that do those things. And people will tell me, well, you're paying extra for that. Well, I'm not really paying extra for it because when you look at the actual cost component, I'm paying less because I don't have 5 people sitting around drinking coffee, eating donuts because then there's no problems in HR. And I can then go to this outsource organization and they can make sure my payroll taxes are paid and my disability taxes are paid in all 50 states. All those things are taken care of. My CFO writes one check, pays them, everything else is taken care of.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that there's hidden companies inside companies. A good example of the opposite of what we're talking about. I think Disney Parks, for a random example, is an HR company.
Right, right,
They're actors, they're dancers, they're servers, they're all that stuff. Disney Parks is an HR company
right.
that attaches amusement rides to the HR company.
Correct, correct.
That's their core business. They have to keep people, train people, recruit people, fire people, and so rapid. I heard a rumor that they hire 10,000 people a quarter.
Probably because what they're hiring in, I don't want to say all of their position, but a lot of their positions are 20 to 30-year-olds that are transitional, right? They're going to college. "Oh, I graduated with my MBA. I don't wanna be
Yeah, so
Mickey Mouse."
that person, that those HR people are highly skilled, highly trained, and need to be in house. For
Right,
most other companies, HR is a luxury item
right.
because the
And it
C-suite typically handles the hiring and firing on a smaller scale company.
right. And there's lots of technologies out there that you can incorporate to help ease all those burdens. And it's really about focusing on what your core competency. If your core competency is making a wrench, focus on making a wrench. Everything else should be outsourced or at least not part of the C-suite or the founder's focus. Make that wrench the best way you can. Take everything else and have somebody else do it. With the other philosophy we have internally is that if I create a department, whether it's research and development, whether it's engineering, whether it's manufacturing, I look at a department and I say, how, and this came from some of my experience working for Department of Defense contractors when it had to do with cross billing and those kinds of things. If we create a department within our company, we look at that department and we say, how can this department support itself? How can it become a cost, a income revenue generating organization in of itself? So let's say we have an engineering department. It costs me $1 million a month to have those people working in engineering. What can I do externally to offset that $1 million a month? Now, it may not be 100%, but maybe what I can do is I can sell the white papers that we create from our engineering and offset that cost. Or maybe I can take 1 day a month of our engineers and utilize them to help startups, and that equity helps offset our cost. I believe that every department within an company should be looked at as an individual company from a profit and loss standpoint. So everybody who runs a division in our company, they're responsible for profit and loss. And if they come to us on a quarterly, monthly basis and they're not managing the profit and loss, we need to correct that. I'm not saying that everybody needs to make a profit, but they need to look at it that way. Otherwise, they'll go buy a box of pens when they only need one.
No, yeah, agreed. I think that's 100% a good piece of advice too. Is when you do get multi departmental in a firm, each department should be profitable,
Right. Right. Or
unless it's a service of the other divisions. But that we just talked about that could be outsourced as well if it's not a profit center.
right, right. Well, it's like our manufacturing division. We're gonna be manufacturing for 3 or 4 other companies. You think we're gonna do that for free?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
even if we own those companies, there's still a cross bill that has to take place. Because when that cross billing takes place, that allows those other 3 companies to have cost of goods management and those kinds of things,
Mhm.
supply chain management. Otherwise,
Well,
they run amok.
here's a thing I want to challenge you with now. Changing the subject.
No problem.
If you had to summarize or pitch a one sentence or a one paragraph Okavate pitch, okay, you're obviously on the verge of closing your large investment, which gets into manufacturing and all the challenges that we just talked about. You walk into that room last day, they haven't signed the check yet, and they need you to tell them exactly what they're signing that check for. What do you say?
Water drives this world. 60 million people a year die because of waterborne diseases. Okavate is positioning to solve that and provide solutions. Either you're part of it or you're not.
Love it. It's true.
I have people right now that want me to come talk at the parliament in India because 2 years ago, they had no interest in what we were doing. Do you know why they have an interest now? They had relatives who passed away because of waterborne diseases. They could have survived. There was no reason for them to pass away. Now, all of a sudden, they start to understand that water coming out of the tap is not a free resource that just comes because you're provisioned to have it. There's a process, there's a reason, there's a risk, there's a reward for it. And now they realize that if we can help solve some of those things, we can help solve water problem. more people will survive.
Well, even with the election, there was a political stance on water.
Yep.
Right? RFK had made a big push that fluoride in water, and the scientists back it up. Fluoride in water is not good for us, even though that was pumped down our throats for 2 generations or 3 generations.
There's never been any scientific proof that fluoride did anything other than
Exactly.
hurt us.
But this you don't have those problems with that. But to your point about tap water or service water, oh, I take it for granted it's there every day. I turn it, it's there. But it's there, but it's not healthy either. So you're you're bringing legitimate atmospheric, unprocessed, unadded, non-additive water to people. That may be the freshest water most of the people who use the product ever have.
It is, and it will be. And the nice thing about atmospheric water generation is that it's basically a distillation condensation process, which means that if we need to remineralize the water, we can do that. If we don't want to mineralize the water and use it for cooling data centers, there's no scaling that takes place because there's no scaling in the water. So now the company doesn't have to spend $500,000 a year descaling their piping system to keep their computers cool. So we have control of what we create. And that's why when we look at it, we say, what is the problem we're trying to solve before we start talking about how much things cost?
It sounds like you're solving more than one problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
We talked, in great detail about the atmospheric impact of weather or damage, tornado, flood,
Yeah.
hurricane. But we're talking about data center descaled water. We're talking about mineralized or demineralized drinking water. We're talking about a purer way of processing water for food plants as well.
That's correct.
You could have a couple of these machines outside of in a specific area. Hershey could change their flavor. Coke could change their flavor to a purer form of their product because of these machines. This isn't a one-stop shop. It only works in this scenario. It works for anything that has water. This could improve it.
Well, we're talking with people who are cannabis growers. Whether you believe in the marketplace or not is really irrelevant, but they use a lot of water. Well, there are people who in the state of California who have been growing cannabis legitimately and legally and all those kinds of things, but their business is being destroyed because California is not allowing them to have any more water. So the solution is, Mr. Cannabis Grower, we can provide you water for your greenhouses. How much is that worth to you? Right.
And you can manipulate the water to add, because every botanist knows the mineral combinations they prefer for their plants.
That's correct.
Hydroponics is an entire science based around that.
That's correct. That's what we did in algae.
You can choose the recipe of the water you're giving to that machine, to that supply, to that customer.
That's correct.
There's so much power in that I don't think is going to be represented on a data sheet or a deck or whatever. I can literally order my water for my plant company, for my organics. I can order water for my chocolate or my soda, company. It's unbelievable what one of these things could do. And all they got to do is have a menu of items to say, this is the additives, the percentages, and this is the combinations I want in this water.
That's correct. And water,
and Okavate can provide that.
Water is a great transport for all those things. So here's two other scenarios for you. I can go on and on about all these, but basically one of the other scenarios is there are developers who are building things. So we know somebody who's building a resort. Now they're investing close to $1 billion in building this resort, but they can't get any building permits because the municipality won't give them any water. So if we give them the water and we create a water solution for them, they get their building permits and they can build their $1 billion resort. Well, how much is the water worth to them to be able to build their $1 billion resort?
$1 less than what they'll make in the first 10 years.
Right. There's other cities. There's cities outside of Phoenix, Arizona, that all of their natural known water sources have dried up.
Yeah, the water table in Arizona has dropped so low that they can't tap it.
Well, there's some solutions to that, but we won't get into that on this podcast. But the problem is that a couple of these towns, and we're talking towns that are less than 10,000 people, 20,000 people, they were buying all their water from Phoenix and having it trucked in. Well, Phoenix last year said, we're not selling you any more water. You've got to find a problem. So we have entire towns, people, humans, schools, businesses, the whole town is without water. We can solve that problem. Again, what are the economics around solving that problem and what's it worth? Right? So, and people go, well, aren't you going to change the atmosphere by growing all that water out? Actually, no. We actually can make it better, but we're not going to make that big of an effect because there's something like 300 trillion billion gallons of water in any given time in the atmosphere. And the problem is actually there's too much water in the atmosphere and it creates ice crystals, which allows for some of the quote unquote global warming climate change situations. Because what has happened is, as a civilization, I'm going to say first world civilizations, we've paved over all of the earth that used to percolate water. So think of your largest shopping center that you could think of. All that land at one time allowed for water to percolate into the groundwater system and into the aquifers. Now it runs off, goes out the ocean, and is evaporated into the atmosphere. 85% of all water that we use, create, and consume as consumers, 85% of it ends up back in lakes, rivers, and streams and the ocean. Only 15% of it goes back to the recycled system. Just to let you know, the state of California just passed a law that wastewater treatment plants can now put 65% of that water back into the municipal system. So now you have to ask about the water quality coming from wastewater treatment plants because that's what you're drinking now. But anyhow, all that water that is now evaporating, which was not evaporating for the last several hundred centuries, creates too much water in the atmosphere, which creates an ice blanket, if you will, which creates climate problems. So it's a bigger issue than just, can we get a clean cup of water, right?
No, it's
So,
fair. We like to end every show with a live attempt at a problem solved that's internal to the company.
yep.
So if there's an Okavate hurdle, challenge, threshold that's currently you're facing, we want to give our best crack at doing a little live strategy session to try to solve that, or at least take the steps towards solving that problem.
I appreciate it.
Would you be willing to share one of the current challenges?
You bet. You bet. So our biggest current, I don't want to say our biggest current challenge, but a challenge that we're about to face is, how do we create a multiplicity manufacturing process that allows us to produce more than one piece of equipment at a time? So we know of contracts we can go after, but the reason why nobody's won the contracts is because nobody can show a manufacturing process that can produce more than one a month, if that, right? So our challenge is using all the things that are our resources, our engineers, our advisors, and everybody else. What size and how do we create and or articulate to the public being investors and other people, how we're going to actually achieve creating an automobile manufacturing scale production line at a decent cost.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is splitting up the pieces and parts, which I'm
Right,
sure you've already considered.
right,
One factory produces 30% of the machine, another factory 30%, another factory 40%, and your home. And then you have an assembly plant that accepts all those shipments in smaller parts and pieces, and then the assembly plant's where the magic happens, where your programmers are, your data, your data is. That would be the first thing that came to my head, but I'm sure you've already vetted that. Is that
right.
not a viable solution to this?
It is and it isn't. It is when we have, let's say in Louisiana, we put a factory down there. That factory is going to be an assembly manufacturing plant, which will coalesce all of the parts and pieces from around the world. The research and development facility in California is going to be the experimental test bed, but we've got to put together a manufacturing process that leverages that experiment as well. And it's really, the challenge isn't, I shouldn't say it this way, but the challenge isn't really some of the manufacturing. It is the assembly process, because the current systems in the world are very technologically probably 10 years behind the game, which means that the new ones we have to put in, security and safety, Internet of Things, remote monitoring, remote controls, using things like carbon materials versus plastic materials, so we don't have microplastics, using things such as aluminum versus stainless steel, those kinds of things, to be able to figure this out, because when we deploy a piece of equipment in the field, and if it's in Florida, we're in California, and we're monitoring it, we've got to make sure all those attributes are working and functional, because water over the last 4 or 5 years has raised its priority of health, safety, and security. Case in point, there's been a few wastewater treatment plants that were hacked by hackers, and because they were automated but didn't have the security in place, their computer systems were hacked, and excess chemicals were about to be deployed into the waste stream of the wastewater treatment plant, which would have either killed or made sick hundreds of thousands of people, simply because some kid decided to hack the wastewater treatment plant. They stopped them and caught them, but the fact of the matter is that happened. So we've got to make sure our equipment doesn't have those vulnerabilities. So our equipment is going to be for the 22nd century, which means we've got to incorporate technologies that nobody else has ever incorporated before
No, that's
at
fair.
a
Like I said,
decent
it's an
cost.
ongoing problem, but it sounds
Right,
like the assembly in one spot, manufacturing in other spots, the data from California, the research in California, and the integration of all of that. It's not like you said. I didn't even consider the fact about the security of it. I just consider the fact of the logistics of it and the security of it, because it's so data heavy and so CPU heavy.
right.
That's it's an ongoing thing. Like you
That's
said,
right.
to service these things is just as important as building them.
Right. It's like if we have a piece of equipment deployed in North Carolina and it's producing 10,000 gallons a day of drinking water, we need to ensure that drinking water is safe at all times, 24 hours a day. We cannot produce a drop of water that's unsafe, nor can
And
we
all it
have a
takes is
system.
one clever hacker, and they could throw
Right.
a wrench in the entire mess.
That's right. And we've got to make sure that from a liability and legal perspective that we've covered all those bases.
No,
And
it
that's
makes
probably
sense.
the hardest. That's going to be the hardest thing, but it's doable. I know it's doable. And probably the first 50 machines that we produce, we're going to lose money on them. But that's the nature of the beast. The first 15 cars that
It's the
Elon
same with
created,
any with
they wrecked
anything. I
them
mean,
into a
if you want to
wall.
boil it
So,
down to a widget,
yep,
until the widgets pay for the machine and the process and the people, that last widget, whether it's widget 7 or widget 7,007, you lost money on those first 7,000,
right.
and you're going to lose money on these for a while until you don't, and then
That's
it'll
right.
be revolutionary and ultimately needed.
And at that point, that inflection point, we'll do an initial public offering. We'll go IPO. And when we go IPO, it's going to be groundbreaking and world changing.
No, that's fantastic. Well, at this point, I'd like to wrap up the episode, and again, just thank you for being on. Again, this is Chris Schuring, Operating Officer of Okavate. Phenomenal chat. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much. And check us out at okavate.com.
And we'll have all of Chris's links and company links on the episode and wherever we publish it as well. So you'll see it out there below the video, probably in the description, and any other social media links that Chris turns over to us. We'll get those out there too. So again, thank you, Chris, for being here, and good luck to everything.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time. Take care.